Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Jonas. I'm the Director of Communications with the National Association for Business Economics. We're pleased to present today's event, which is hosted by the NABE Policy Roundtable. I did want to mention before we start the upcoming NABE Economic Policy Conference. This will take place next week, March 22nd to 23rd. The event will be held virtually with 2 full days of programming and virtual networking opportunities. We have Governor Lael Brainerd confirmed to speak, as well as Tom Barkin from the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, Jim Bullard from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, and Laurent Spoon, Chief Economist of the OECD, amongst many others. We still have registration available for this event. Just go to nabe.com to register. I also wanted to mention that tomorrow we'll be hosting a joint webinar with AUBR, that's the Association for University Business and Economic Research. Are you moving without knowing it? OMB's proposal to redefine metro and micropolitan areas. That will take place tomorrow, Tuesday, March 16th at 2 p.m. Eastern. We'll be hearing from federal government experts on the full details of the proposal and their ramifications for federal statistical and funding programs, and learn how you can weigh in with comments to the OMB while the proposal is still under review. Okay, on to today's event. Note that we'll have Q&A open throughout today's discussion. You could submit questions to the panelists at any time using the Q&A box. There will be slide presentations accompanying today's event, and we'll be posting links to the slide presentations in the chat box. Okay, it's my pleasure now to introduce our moderator. Diane Lim is Adjunct Professor of Economics with George Washington University, and she is co-host of the NABE Policy Roundtable. Diane, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thanks, Chris. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're talking about a really important topic, of course, the very recently enacted American Rescue Plan, now called the American Rescue Plan Act. And today we're talking about the macroeconomic effects, or in the anticipated macroeconomic effects of the act. And I'm very pleased to have 2 of my female economist colleagues on today. And we have Wendy Edelberg first, who spent many years at CBO and has more recently joined the Brookings Institution as the director of the Hamilton Project, and also a senior fellow in economic studies at Brookings. And also Claudia Sahm, who is a former Fed employee, is known for the Sahm rule, as well as the brilliantly titled now Stay at Home Macro website and newsletter. And she is currently a senior fellow at the Jain Family Institute as well. So, and a columnist in several places. So we're going to proceed with Wendy making a presentation about her forecast of the effects of the package on macroeconomic growth, GDP effects. And she'll go for about 10 minutes, and then Claudia will weigh in particular about, the discussions that we've heard a lot of in recent days about, is the package too big? Is it too big given that the vaccines are rolling out and there's now some, economic recovery on its own? What will this package do in terms of inflation and interest rate worries? So without further ado, Wendy, welcome. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. It is great to be here with both you and Claudia, Diane. All right, so let me see if I can do this. I'm going to try to share my screen. Let's see if it works. Successful? Yes? Excellent. Wonderful. Okay, so what I'm going to show you is some analysis I did with a colleague of mine, Louise Shaner, at the Brookings Institution. This was analysis we did of Biden's proposed package that he put out in January. What actually is now in law is only moderately different in ways that I don't think have any kind of notable effect on what I would think the aggregate effects on the economy would be. So I'm going to go ahead and show you this analysis we did of how the package was initially proposed, and just know that I think that they're still quite informative for the current package. Okay, so this picture has a bunch of different lines on it. Let me just walk you through what these lines are. The top teal line is CBO's projection of GDP in January 2020. So what they thought GDP would look like between the beginning of 2020 and the end of 2023 before the pandemic hit, so in January of last year. The next line down is CBO's current projection of potential output. And they have knocked that down since January, but that is their current projection of potential as of February 2021. The bottom line, so let's begin with first the darker blue part of it, that's a solid line. That's where GDP actually was since the beginning of 2020. And you can see, obviously, there was a massive shortfall in GDP relative to the pre-pandemic path, and even, of course, relative to CBO's estimate of potential output over the course of 2020. And then the dotted line is what, the dotted blue line at the bottom is what CBO projected output would be under, now this slide is old, under what was current law as of February 2021. So this is basically CBO's projection of output, not including the recently passed $1.9 trillion package, but including all of the other fiscal support that had been passed to try to help the economy. And then the green line, the green dotted line, the all-important green line, is what we project GDP will look like now with the package in hand. And what you can see is that not only does GDP rise well above CBO's estimate of potential, it also rises well above, for a time, CBO's projection of the pre-pandemic path of GDP. So what this means is that some of the economic activity lost over the course of 2020 would be made up in the coming quarters. We estimate that the Biden package will result in real GDP exceeding what would have been the projected path for GDP in absence of that package by 3.6% at the end of 2021. And by 2.1% at the end of 2022. So what does that mean for our projection of GDP over the course of the next 2 years? This path has Q4 real GDP growth of about 8% in 2021 and just a modest 1% in 2022. And in fact, there are a couple of quarters there in the middle of 2022 where we have very slight negative growth. Just super fast before we get on to other issues, we estimate that the positive output gap between GDP and potential would peak at 2.6% in the first quarter of 2022. All right, so the positive output gap, we do indeed think would put some upward pressure on inflation. In fact, I think if it didn't put upward pressure on inflation, that would be alarming on its own and raise its own risks. The Federal Reserve has been very clear that they would welcome additional inflationary pressure and inflation rising above 2% for a time. And I do think that this inflationary pressure would be temporary. That said, I think that the risks caused by this package are not so much, or this path of GDP, are not so much the increase in GDP over the next year, which I think would be quite welcome. It's how the economy responds to the slowdown on the other side of the mountain. So as you can see, we are projecting a soft landing. And as I'm sure just about everybody listening in knows, soft landings are exceedingly rare in the actual data. So just a couple more minutes on how we did this analysis. What we did is we took the entire $1.9 trillion package and we bucketed it into four different categories, thinking about major categories where we thought the category had some uniform aspects to it of how either the agencies or the households responding to those outlays, some uniform aspect of what those responses would look like and how big they would be and how fast they would be. And so the biggest category is $750 billion for COVID-19 containment and vaccination. We think that money will be spent relatively quickly, mostly by state and local agencies, spending that money to contain the pandemic and to get the vaccine out as quickly as possible. That also includes the $350 billion in aid to state and local governments that's not targeted to any specific line item, we think that money would be spent rather slowly. There's also $600 billion in direct aid to families, $400 billion in aid to financially vulnerable households. That's like unemployment insurance and other kinds of aids to households that are feeling financial pain. We think that money would also be spent relatively quickly. And the relatively small amount of $150 billion to aid to businesses. That includes money for childcare providers and grants to small businesses, loans to businesses, and paid sick leave. This is my last slide, just showing you then how these different categories are estimated to affect GDP. You can see that the biggest effect stems from the roughly $750 billion, that big category of COVID-19 containment and vaccination and the other money for state and local governments. That amount, I'm trying to find the color, the dark green, the long dark green region, that's the largest, not just because the 750 billion is the largest category, just in terms of dollars, but also because of how we estimate that the agencies would spend that money. We think that the marginal propensity to consume, if you will be very, very slow in some cases, but it will begin to approach one over the course of many years, some of those years occurring outside of the range that we've plotted here. And then the smallest is the 150 billion for aid to businesses. Again, that's for two reasons. One, the 150 billion is a relatively smaller amount in this package, but also we estimate that the economic effect of that aid to businesses is smaller than the economic effects of the other categories. So a smaller bang for the buck, if you will. And I think I should stop there. I'm not sure if I've taken too long or too little, but I am happy to turn it over to Claudia.
Okay, great. All right, let me get my screen shared. Oh, full screen. Okay, hopefully that looks okay. I should start with kind of a fun fact. So Wendy was actually the person that trained me how to forecast when I started at the Federal Reserve in 2007, 2008. So she is not to blame for anything that I show here, but Wendy's first words to me, and actually this early in January of 2008, when we were putting the stimulus payments in late on a Friday afternoon, I was totally freaking out. It was my first forecast. Wendy looked at me and she's like, "You have got to calm down." So this has been a very good advice for me that I don't actually implement very well, but I will try not to freak out with all of you. Okay, so what I wanted to talk about briefly, and this follows on some of the things Wendy just said, is this question of what comes next. And actually, it looks like I said twice next. So I'm really focused on the future here. And we had really big things happen last week with the $2 trillion pact.
Can I interrupt? Can I encourage you to click the X on your reopen closed PDFs thing that's sitting on top of your slide?
Yeah.
There you go.
Okay, good. It was kind of hiding my typo.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, so we had a lot happen last week. We had $2 trillion passed. This was a little bit of a nail biter. It passed. That is on top of $4 trillion last year. So I have, in my Twitter feed, see a lot of progressives and people being like, "Meh, we didn't get this, we didn't get that." I'm like, oh my gosh, $6 trillion. Let's be happy here with some risks. I'm going to talk about this. So we have this, and then as all of you know, we are navigating an absolutely unprecedented Federal Reserve policy, right? So we have a lot of things going on in the fiscal space and in monetary policy. So we absolutely need to be thinking about what is it that we are moving into. Okay, so just as a very high level for a few things I'm going to talk through, inflation is a risk, right? Any of us that do forecasting, we think of what is most likely, what is a downside, like what's something bad that can happen, and what's something good that could happen, right? Like I did pay attention while Wendy was teaching me. And so it's important to engage with those risks. And it's important as this year goes forward that we keep updating as like the world changes. I firmly believe, having looked at a lot of data, a lot of research, that inflation is not the risk right now. So I'm going to show you some data in just a minute. what I see as the risk, like right now, as we go into the next few months and through the end of this year, even, the risk we're facing is that we could have an unsafe, inequitable recovery. Like we are blasting trillions of dollars into the economy. There's been a lot of talk about like as soon as it open up, we're all going to go on vacation and do things. And I do think we're in this period of transition that could be really tricky on a public health side, like on a people side, and be connected once again to the economics. So I think to me, that's what I'm focused, like I think we should really think about right now. And as we go later into the year and to next year, I feel like, and this messaging is coming from both the administration and from the Federal Reserve, we need a recovery for all, right? That is the goal right now, getting people safely back to work. There's a longer term goal of getting us to a better place in February, but like I do think we got to like do this in sequential order or try. Okay, so the first thing, and this pushes a little bit back on some of the analysis Wendy was showing us. Like I truly believe potential is a policy choice, right? Like just the way, and what I'm showing you here in the chart are the different paths, all indexed back to the beginning of 2005, what have been estimates of potential output from the Congressional Budget Office. Now, the CBO is not special, like in the, like, this is how the Fed does it, this is how a lot of forecasters do it. It goes back to Art Oken in the 1960s. Like we do this in a particular way. We're adding things up. It does happen that that the potential output estimates are sensitive to the moment, like the GDP where we are right now. And so there is a possibility, not a given, but a possibility that we can shape our potential going forward through policy. And I feel like, having watched the Great Recession, the very slow recovery, I feel like that ratcheting down of expectations was a policy choice, a fiscal policy that was too weak. Potential doesn't always go this way down. Before, in the tech booms of the late 90s, it went the other way. So I do think there's this pattern. Doesn't mean history is going to repeat itself, but I do think a lot of the potential output arithmetic that I've been hearing on the news is like, we got to be really careful about that, you know. Okay, so the other thing that I have been very struck by is some of the inflation hawkery. Again, this is a risk we should have. I have no particular anger at the hawks. That, like, when we talk about things like aggregate compensation is like back on track, right? Like, and it took a big hit early in the year. We're back on track. GDP looks pretty good. And yet, I think we have to be really careful at these totals, because underneath the totals, we have massive inequality, right? So this is analysis. This is newish data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. They estimate a distribution of personal income. And so what I'm showing you here, and you can see, like, the top 10% are not like the other, right? And they're quite different even than the next 20%. And what I'm showing you is income. The latest data we have are from 2018, but then, like, that's the personal income by deciles of personal income. And then I'm putting on top of that the relief, right? 2 trillion is a lot of money. You spread it out across the bottom 80% of households. It does mean a lot in percentage terms down at the bottom, but, like, you know, we went into this with a lot of inequality. I think one of the reasons we need a robust recovery is to make sure that we don't create even more inequality through this crisis, which we absolutely did with the Great Recession. So I think it's, again, like, just like potential output, we should be a little cautious, like hanging our hat on it. I also think that's true of the aggregates and GDP. And I love forecasting aggregates. Like, that's what I did for 10 years. I love the detail accounts of BA and consumer spending. I could play in there all day, but I do think we have to think about, like, who's spending what, who has that income, as the behavior is different. Like, really high income people are more than happy to sock it away and do a bunch of wealth, right? So I think this, you know, whatever. We're going to see how things play out, but I do think we got to look under the hood too. Okay. And the last kind of data I wanted to put on the table is we have a long way to go, right? And I think I've been really impressed with the Fed in that they have, maybe even unlike the past, have really embraced the maximum employment part of their dual mandate. I mean, they always care about inflation. You talk about getting down in the detailed data. They are not letting up on that, but really thinking hard about what does it mean to get people back to work, right? And they for a long time have looked at a whole dashboard of different labor market indicators, but I think they're thinking really hard, not just about how to do it internally, but how to message it publicly. So what I'm showing you, and I thought this was so brilliant when Jay Powell brought this out in a speech, is these are unemployment rates relative to right at the beginning of the recession. Like I use the Sahm rule to date, like the first couple months of the recession. And this is what we're looking at here are the severe recessions that we've seen over the past decades. And I mean, when the solid red line are the official unemployment statistics for the COVID recession and the recovery we're into. And you know, we all live this, right? The unemployment rate shot up. The poor Sahm rule, like, was orders and I mean, it was a lot higher really fast, right? So we live this free fall, and we have seen the unemployment rate come down quickly. Like I was surprised how fast it came down, which was good. Like we brought, you know, of the $20 million hole of jobs, we got halfway back up, you know, into the summer, early fall. So this is good. We still have 10 trillion to go. The thing that Jay Powell pointed out is if we have had a very unusual circumstance of millions of people leaving work, right? Choosing to walk away from jobs, whether it's they have to take care of their kids or an older family member, whether they're afraid of dying, right? Like there are just a lot of reasons. And you go back, we talk about after the Great Recession, there was a decline in labor force participation. If you look at the number of people, which is what you need to do to adjust unemployment, like it is massive, right? Like we have just had, and we would expect a lot of these people to come back, right? Once it's safe and once their kids are back at school. So what the dotted red line does is it assumes, okay, all those people who were in February have left. Let's call them unemployed. Let's put them in the statistic. And then they add on the Bureau of Labor Statistics' own estimate of the measurement error. That's much smaller, right? The big thing is these people moving. And like they, you know, by that estimate, the level of the unemployment rate is about 10%. Came down a little bit a couple Fridays ago, but it's still really high and really high relative to severe recession. So I think this way of, and that dash line is totally what the administration should be using as a benchmark, because like there's going to be funky things still happening in the official rate. So we have a long way to go. Yes, there are risks with another 2 trillion on top of 4 trillion before that, but we can't take, we have to take really seriously how far we are from where we should be. And like the more time it takes to get back just to February of 2020, the more damage is done. So I'm actually very hopeful there's less damage done. We do have to be very careful about the risks, and we are absolutely uncharted territories. I expect markets to keep like having little minor freakouts for several months, and I don't blame them. They're trying to figure out what's going on. Anyway, so that's the piece I wanted to share. I have a longer piece that I wrote about like the inflation and more data in case you want 3,000 words of this. Okay, that's what I got. Thanks. Let me unshare.
Thanks, Claudia and Wendy. So I'd like to encourage those of you who are attending and listening, if you have questions, I know a bunch of you have popped in questions already, just type it in the Q&A, and I am going to try to sift through some of those, but I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and ask the first questions before I figure out how your questions also jive with my questions. So the first question is that I found it interesting that in Wendy's charts about where we're expected to go with this new rescue plan relative to estimates of potential GDP, that you're showing us getting above those earlier estimates of potential GDP. And I want to ask both of you a question about potential GDP, and that is, do you think economists really know how to measure potential GDP? How do we see something that we haven't seen before? And in particular, with the distributional impacts that you've shown, Why is that so important in terms of determining whether our potential GDP might be actually quite a bit higher than what we have measured in the past? Why is the distributional story about this rescue package so important?
So let me try to take it first, and I am betting that Claudia wants to weigh in too. So obviously we never see potential, and so for that reason, among many others, it's subject to enormous uncertainty. I think it's still a very useful benchmark. We need some sense of where the economy would be if we didn't have unusual temporary frictions. I think that it helps to give policymakers, at the very least, it helps to give policymakers a target of whether or not they think the economy is running hot or cold. I think simply that fact is informative for policymakers. And I do think we know a fair amount about when the economy, at least in a qualitative sense, is running hot or cold, really hot, really cold. We are quite confident right now that we are operating under our potential. We were quite confident during the Great Recession that we were operating under our potential. And that was really informative for policymakers to want to do more. I'll just take one little tangent and then come back to your main question. You might remember that after the Great Recession, there was a big question about how much permanent scarring we had in the labor market and whether or not we had such scarring in the labor market that had lowered potential, so that maybe we needed to be more cautious about how much we should push the economy to improve aggregate demand. We needed to be cautious about that in this worldview, because there was so much scarring that would overheat the economy. And there was not complete consensus as to how much permanent scarring there was in the labor market. I was at CBO at the time, and we put in a modest amount, but we were certainly pressed to be putting in more, and that we were too optimistic on whether or not we had overestimated the potential in the labor market. And those sorts of arguments were quite informative for policymakers. So I don't think that we just want to throw out our view of potential because it's unseen. And so again, but okay, then the other tangent I want to take super fast is that yes, potential output is absolutely, well, first it's endogenous, and second of all, it is a policy choice. It's endogenous in that the more economic growth we have, the more investment we have, that directly feeds into the potential of an economy. It's also a policy choice because the more we lower frictions, make it easier for people to work, lower the costs of working, lower the cost of investing. The more we make those policy choices and structurally give people opportunities, that increases potential. So absolutely, it's a policy choice. So again, talking to policymakers about how their policy choices affect potential is again a useful conversation. The last thing I want to say is that I strongly believe that with this fiscal package in hand, we will be running the economy hot. We will be running the economy above potential. Strongly believe that. And I actually think that is an intentional part of this fiscal policy package. And so, again, I think that potential is useful there because it's telling policymakers, no, success on that front, you will run the policy hot, you will run the economy hot, and then we can think about what the risks and consequences are of that.
Very good. Yeah. Claudia?
Yeah, so I will say, I know, to start on a happy, generous note. So I do think, that the methods, the way we think about potential output, and these are very carefully thought through. Like I've listened to John Fernald, like how he makes it, oh my God, so there's a lot of thinking, and it does create a conversation, and this bottom up, like knowing the inputs, like this is really important. I don't blame CBO with what people do with their estimates. Like, I do think that they are abused and used to say, oh, we can't do enough. And I do think this point of it's a policy choice, and even this feedback through investment, I feel like this is not internalized in the way I'd like to see in some very prominent macroeconomic debates, right? So, but we got to start somewhere. Now, I do have reservations about the degree to which macroeconomic policy depends on variables that we don't see, right? So I'm very ecumenical. I have issues with Y star, pi star, I star. Like, I mean, like I can go, you know, because these are things that are very ingrained in how we think about what's good policy. And you got to be really careful because if you have enough free parameters, you can justify anything, and then it becomes very hard to falsify points of view or because we're, you know, things are mushy. In the piece I linked to, I mean, I have a somewhat lengthy discussion of my views about inflation expectations, right? This is a whole other conversation, but it does relate to some of these questions about overheating. But it has kicked off a conversation. I saw a lot of really thoughtful analysis at the Fed over time about inflation dynamics and how like the Fed just can't say we want 2%, like they have to like do it, right? And it moves slowly. So I think we've come a long way in that conversation. One of the things that I'm going to write about this soon at Bloomberg when I stop doing press and these kind of awesome events is some of that bottom up thinking. We again need to like look under the hood, right? So with unemployment, when we think about what's the natural rate of unemployment, for any of these, we have to look back at past relationships and like we got to, you know, we are measuring this in some, we're estimating it. We're not just like pulling it out of a hat. Well, we have structural inequalities in the labor market, right? If we rely on what's in the past, we are baking in our expectations of the future, the fact that the Black unemployment rate is twice the white unemployment rate. The fact that, you know, so like these are things that I don't like there. It's not the intention that we're baking these into our estimates, but we need to acknowledge the fact that some of our assumptions that are based on the past, like we could change and like we should, right? Like systemic racism in the labor market is a bad thing, right? And if we use that to hold ourselves back and say, whoa, this, you know, these people are never coming back, and it's like, well, if you gave them a chance, they might. And I think this was a big lesson late in the expansion, is people who we had written off, and even those like CBO and the Fed that were like, oh yeah, we can do more. Some of the people we had written off, they came back, right? So I think that's, you know, to me, like use every tool you have, bring everything you can to the discussion, but also acknowledge, and Wendy does, the colleagues I had at the Fed do, acknowledge like the humility and the uncertainty around it. And then the policymakers decide, right? Like we are not in charge, thank God. So you just bring it all that you can.
Can I, just because this is such an interesting conversation, let me just, I want to jump in and say one other thing. So when you think about like, okay, here's our projection, you know, here's my projection as a forecaster of the labor force participation rate. But it could be much higher, it could be much lower. When you start to get into much higher, much lower, you do indeed have to start grappling immediately with, well, then they're going to have to be structural changes. Like if the labor force participation rate is going to be much higher than what you project over, let's say, a 10-year period, like then let's start looking at structural changes with that might occur. So for example, women's labor force participation has largely plateaued. Pre-pandemic, it had largely plateaued. That is, again, you know, that is based on structural factors in our economy and in our policy and our preferences. That's not to say those are immutable. Like, obviously, those can change. We saw massive changes in women's labor force participation over decades and decades. But I think it is still useful for an economist in doing a projection to say, let me take those as given and project what I think, given what appear to be women's preferences, given what the structural challenges are for women's labor force participation and the policies that they confront, here's the labor force participation that I'm going to project for them. That's not just, it's not an upper bound, but it's taking all of those factors as given. I think there's absolutely a useful role for that.
Mhm. So, both of you talked about potential GDP being endogenous, and a big part of the question about what the economic effects of this rescue plan are going to be. Can you address, let's go back to the overheating worry, and maybe the fiscal outlook worry, like all the things that we might worry about if this were a typical economic recession and we were throwing money into the economy for the sole purpose of increasing aggregate demand. Why is it so important that you've both said that this package could absolutely have an effect on the supply side of the economy and not just the demand side of the economy? What will happen, to get a little bit more pointed, if some households are getting more money from this package than what they had before the pandemic started? What is the problem with that in terms of overheating the economy?
Yeah, so I'll start a little bit more at a family worker level. So these were huge questions. I mean, when the CARES Act put in the extra $600 a week for the unemployed, I like to say I did not sleep until that passed the Senate. I mean, at some point I was like, they're going to figure out, like, this is really, really good, right? And so, and a legitimate risk when you talk about work disincentives, right? And I do think small business owners that have very low wage jobs that maybe aren't like fun jobs, like maybe they're messy or what, like, I think legitimately they've probably had a harder time bringing people back. And that, can squeeze the bottom line in a world where they don't have a lot of customers either, right? So I hear them on that. I think there's some very good research that started to come out. Like, we're not in a definitive place, but you have like the JP Morgan Chase Institute group that has been at this for, 5 or 6 years now with their data set, looking at exactly when the $600 was expiring, seeing if like they started seeing paychecks come in and it really looked like people, when they had the chance to go back to work, went back to work. Like, I strongly disagree with the sentiment that these relief packages are going to undermine the culture of work in this country, right? And this is a robust debate about the child benefits, right, that aren't as tied like they're an income tax credit. I just think we love to work in general, and that's just an important part of who we are. But again, we are doing unprecedented policy interventions, and we are going to learn a lot in this next year, the next few years, about how to best fight recessions, and also cash relief to family, like what's the right way to support people. One other thing that I'll say in this, like, kind of thinking about people, I've gotten very frustrated in the debate about the rescue plan, where various economists, and this is actually, I've heard this from many different macroeconomists, well, 2 trillion isn't such a bad thing, but $1 trillion of it should be infrastructure, right? We should be fighting climate change, fighting inequality, like whatever. I think it's a mistake that we aren't thinking about some of this package, specifically the aid to families, as investment, right? We have for decades had many families who have very thin financial buffers. This makes it difficult to just keep life going. Like, I had a family friend that lost her job because she didn't have the money to fix her car. I've known people that have, not been able to get to an interview because they didn't have the bus fare, right? Like, we are pushing money to people who have really been on thin ice for a long time, and just to give them some breathing room. And frankly, that goes up into the, middle class. Like, we've had this real big imbalance. I am very big on empowering people, right? Like, I really am in favor of the stimulus checks as opposed to some of the other ways we've helped families, because it lets them decide what their family needs. Some savings, some spending. So, and I think especially whatever we do to help families with children, like, I can't think of a better investment than our children being off in a good place. But those are not, like, this isn't going to, where it will show up in GDP is not investment, right? So I think this is where it's just going to be hard. Long run growth shows up in little dribs and drabs. in trend. So whereas we're going to see like April consumer spending is going to be lit. Like, I mean, there are things where we're going to see this coming through, and then there's the long-term benefits we're just not going to see for a while. And we'll have to weigh out the short-term risks of temporary inflation versus, I mean, there's just a lot of things going on. So that's what I would say about the investment piece.
I largely agree with what Claudia said and what she emphasized. I think that in terms of this pretty significant income redistribution that this package has in it, which it's not everything in the package, but it's a big part of it. I think that we will see it may be difficult to find it in the aggregate data over the next decade, let's say, but I do think that goes in the right direction of making households feel more financially secure so that they can handle whatever whatever idiosyncratic or aggregate shocks they face over the next decade. It helps them to have the resources to invest. It's all of those things that we think wealth does in order to make families more secure and better able to invest in their own futures. The one thing that I want to say that I don't think Claudia said was that this package also does a fair amount to improve the economy over the next few quarters. The faster we get the pandemic under control and we get the vaccine distributed and we make sure that businesses can stay open and we make sure that schools can open, the better our economy will be over the next few quarters. So that's not long-term potential in my mind. That's in a sense, short-term potential, if you will.
But you also showed, Wendy, that a lot of the certain aspects of the package, like the aid to families that are lower income families and the COVID vaccine rollout, you show those as having longer than stimulus-like effects on GDP still. Like they go out several, years beyond this year.
There's still stimulus effects. You may not. So we don't usually see such long-lived significant stimulus effects because we're not normally estimating a $1.9 trillion package.
Right.
So we think that it's going to take a lot. Households are going to save a fair bit, and that's not in these numbers. That's in wealth numbers, and so not in these effects on aggregate demand. But it's going to take a long time. For example, for state and local government agencies to spend this money, I actually don't think that they'll fully spend the money for at least 5 years. It takes a long time.
Right. Okay. So what about, there's some questions specifically about women and female labor force participation. What in this particular rescue plan is going to have an effect on that, and how? Like, do we actually have to worry about too much assistance for providing too much income to families because they have children is going to reduce the likelihood that the women who have pulled back in their labor force participation or had to quit jobs will actually go back to work? Do we have to worry about that?
So I know Claudia will have more to say about this. So let me just say a little bit and then I'll step back. So if us giving, and I know some of the numbers out there can be quite large for how much a family might be getting if it's in particularly dire straits right now. But if us making a family whole from the financial pain that they're in, or us giving a family a few $1,000s means that they say, you know what, then I am no longer financially desperate enough to be able to work. Like I'm comfortable with that trade-off as a society. If that's the knife edge you were on of feeling so desperate that you needed to work and that you would prefer not to, and that it makes more sense for your family not to. That said, there are enormous things in this package that will help women work and will lower the cost of working for women and parents with young children. So the child care tax credit, reopening schools, making schools safe, getting the vaccine distributed, there are, I think on net, it is just a no-brainer that this package will make it easier for women and people generally and parents of young children. It will make it easier for them to work and improve labor force participation.
Yeah, no, and I like to say with this package in particular, the big winners were the children, right? I started my career at the Fed studying the stimulus checks.
Mhm.
Every time we have done these checks, especially if you consider December and now to get, like, they have gotten bigger. Like, I had no idea we could give out this much money. Like, this is amazing. And this last check, the children get $1,400. Like, if their family qualifies for the full check, that's huge. We've never given kids the same amount. And then there are these benefits that are come out regularly. One of the things I like about the stimulus check and the start we're doing with the cash transfers for children, there's much more like a cash benefit for kids. They have the opportunity to reach far down into the holes of our safety net, right? The children's benefits don't have a work requirement. I love it. Larry Kudlow was like, I can't find it. And I'm like, because it's not there. So this is an opportunity to reach down into like deep poverty, to reach down into parts like, and with the checks, I talked to a lot of unemployed people and people that advocated for the unemployed, and they were so all over these checks because it is hard, and if like really hard in some places in this country to get jobless benefits, right? And the IRS was pretty good at getting checks to people. So I think we're seeing this, like, at least we're trying to do in a big way, getting money to people, and then in particular families. And I think like there was a lot of talk, and I think early in the recession, and there are some aspects of it where it was kind of the she session, and it hit industries like the services industries much harder than say usually it would be in construction or like everything was upside down in this. I think as we've gone along, what you can see is it's parents, right? It's whoever has caregiving responsibilities, particularly of young children that have just really suffered. Some people have caregiving of adults, right, that are at high
Mhm.
risk. So, like, and I think I'm encouraged to see, and I think we have to have conversations at different workplaces about what having stepped away will mean, right? Like at universities, some people have had a super productive year and some people have had like didn't get anything done that looks like work. So I think I would be more concerned about a smooth reentry for parents and like not disturbing their careers because like COVID happened to the world than people getting a couple $100s a month and be like, oh, I can stay home, right? Like there will be some of that, but it's also like if that's what you think your kids need, particularly like when they're why would we step in and say, oh, no, you need to go to work 3 jobs, never see your kids, right? So I think, but like I said before, we've moved into territory with policy that we haven't been in before. Good intentions are not enough. Some of these programs are not going to work, or they could have unintended consequences. And I think one of the things I find most troubling in some of the policy work I've done is that we have a hard time once we really like a policy to like say, hey, that piece didn't work well. And I think hard about what are the scenarios that we see inflation and the Fed pulls back. I don't want them to have to do it this year, but like I could be flat ass wrong. Like, I mean, there could be like real problems here. And then we have to be willing to back up and fix it instead of just saying, well, it was our idea and we passed it. And, so we're going to learn a lot and we have to make sure we are open to learning.
Where do you both think we're most likely to see in the economy inflationary pressure? How is that going to show up? And do you think that the models that economists are using to try to figure out that inflation risk, are they capturing what you think they need to be looking at?
So I know that there's crazy stuff happening in the housing market and in rental prices. So I'm mostly going to put that aside because that's just crazy, and people will be looking at those numbers very carefully. I think what's going to make this recovery so unusual is that the big bounce that we're going to see is in services spending.
Mhm.
And so we're going to see some weird inflationary pressure in services that is not typically characteristic of a recovery.
What kind of services do you think?
I think airline prices are going to go through the roof. I think restaurant prices are probably going to rise. I think basically any service that demands face-to-face interaction, we are probably going to see bottlenecks there where people are going to realize, so service providers are going to realize they're actually better off raising their prices to get the queues down because they just can't meet all the demand.
Yeah, and I think this is one where we've had policies like the payroll protection loan program, as many problems as it had. It has been able to keep workers more connected with their employers than in the absence of that program. We
Right.
did see a very high rate of temporary layoffs, and while they've turned much more to permanent, like there's still a lot of temporary layoffs. So the extent to which we have workers really connected to their jobs, like should be able to, when the customers come back, the employees can come back. Now, I do think Wendy's right. There are some places where capacity is a lot, like we think of airlines as services, but like really you got to have the airplanes, right? So there is kind of, and you got to bring highly trained and specialized workers back, right? So like those will take time. That's absolutely the poster child for a temporary burst of prices. And airlines are not a huge part of the US economy, right? Like, and I think that whereas health services, again, we've got a lot of unused capacity. I mean, people in the hospital staff that are just ready to get going again. And then I think the other thing, like, it's really interesting. We had this massive explosion in goods spending, right? And this is a place where, again, we would think like there's only so many little machines to make widgets and how many cars can you do at once? And we have seen some price pressure. I love, you can pick up, the major newspapers and find the one little price index that is like running off to the moon off a very low base. But like we didn't see this massive pickup in goods inflation. Right.
Yeah.
Like it did increase in a way that usually goods prices have been pretty flat, because of quality adjustments. We had this massive reshift in our economy within like months. So I think we could see some rebalancing, like some of the goods prices where there had been a little pressure coming down, services coming up. I was talking with Julia Coronado last week and she said, pent up demand when it's services demand is probably going to look really different than when it's pent up demand for autos. So again, like we haven't seen this. I'm less. And then the thing is too, if we have just jammed so much money in people's hands that they want to like do more service spending than before, like services is one place where we have a lot more flexibility. Like, restaurants, you just like crank up the food trucks and run. Like there are ways that I think we can deal with certain demand in services that are very hard to do in goods. And even if you're in goods, as Gita Gopinath has, stressed, like we have major deflationary pressures around the globe. Now, it'll net out of GDP if we're doing all this imported, but in terms of like consumers facing higher and higher prices, the rest of the world is lagging far behind our vaccination pace, our like getting the economy back online. And a lot of the places we've imported from for a very long time, like they're kind of last in line for the vaccine. So I think there's a lot of places that could take that inflationary pressure out. And I really don't think consumers are going to get really worked up until you've got 3% plus inflation. Now the Fed is going to get way freaked out before that. So like, I'm not worried, but I think we have to, kind of balance it out. Like people really hate not having a job or not like having a paycheck that kind of has got some oomph behind it. But yeah, and I guess back to your original question, like honestly, the people at the Fed who work on inflation, and there's a lot of them, every single tea leaf, like parsing it down to basis points, right? Which was not like when we worked on consumer spending, if you're within a quarter point, it's like, and even that, with investment, if you're within, 3 or 4 percentage points, you're doing good. So I think there will be such a focus on inflation. I worry more about a hyper focus on inflation that takes over some of the other things like labor market, public safety, like that we need to be focused on. But we should look at all of it.
It seems to me that you're both talking about inflation, this inflationary pressure being much more service oriented this time. a lot of that, if I think about who's going to go crazy and go back to the restaurants and spend lots of money on housing, or they're not the people that are getting the relief as much as the people who are higher income, who just had their demand for these services constrained by the fact that there's been this public health crisis. Does it seem like, I don't know, I was thinking that maybe the package will get too much blame for any inflationary pressure, as if it was because the package is expensive, rather than the reason being for the increase in demand because people are like finally set free from quarantine, right? And how does that affect the prospects of more spending, more packages, more legislation that the Biden administration wants to pursue, in terms of, the sheer size of this package has obviously gotten fiscal hawks concerned and inflation hawks concerned. But is it sort of like we can't just we can't just look at our past experiences in terms of what is too much deficit spending, what is too much relief, right, as stimulus, to conclude that something is going to overheat the economy or be too fiscally irresponsible. So maybe I'm segueing also to, because we're almost out of time, the size of the package. What do you think the effect is going to be? Maybe Wendy can take this first, since from her CBO days. What is the effect going to be on the fiscal outlook? And is this a problem? Is this going to permanently, is this inappropriate, the size of the borrowing that we're doing for this Relief Act?
All right, so there's a lot in there. And
2 minutes.
and I do see that we're running out of time. The package is very large. I see it as being large in a way that gives us a lot of insurance, that we have reduced the chances of undershooting where we would want to be. Mm-hmm. So that's how I see it. I think that financial markets will absorb the borrowing. So that, and that's my basic criteria as to whether or not it's irresponsible. Like, does it create risks that we have actually like hit up against a wall of financial markets not demanding these treasuries, and they will absorb it without interest rates going into alarming territory. So I don't think it's irresponsible. Yes, it's going to increase the size of our debt, and it's going to increase then our interest costs going forward to service that debt. But it makes perfect sense to me that's worth doing in order to take out the insurance in where I started, that we want to make sure that we have a good economy for the next few years, and that economic growth is widely shared.
Claudia.
Yeah, no, and so I fully agree. I think, especially on the borrowing costs, like if you had to bet on an economy in this world right now, if you had savings, the US is where you do it, right? So we're going to have enough people that want treasuries that we're going to be able to sell them, and the rates will be manageable. They'll probably come up some, but they're going to be manageable. And that's good. And like, that is not a God-given right that we have low treasury yields. And that is because our economy is dynamic and grows. Like, so we cannot put that on the line by being penny wise, pound foolish right now. And yet, like, it's going to be a bumpy ride, right? And Congress will get blamed for this. Both parties will end up getting blamed by the other party. The Fed always gets blamed, right? Like, this is, so there's going to be, but at the end of the day, if people have a bigger paycheck, they got their jobs back, they don't have to struggle, they're going to be happy, right? Like, I mean, it'll make a difference regardless of who gets credit for it or who gets, I mean, that is so past the economics, that's just politics, but we got to focus on making people whole, giving them a better path forward. That's going to be really hard, right? Like, and I do think going forward, it's going to, after $6 trillion, it's really relief and a lifeline. It will be much harder. And I would not expect in the infrastructure package to have like stimulus checks for everyone, or you might have the child benefits, but like it will shift in terms of being about infrastructure, investment. It's going to be an absolute free for all, because even if it's $2 to $3 trillion, that goes really fast when you're like fighting for the future. So I think it'll be a robust debate. We should have it. There are going to be pay-fors in this one. Like there's no way this is just all deficit spending. So yeah, we're gonna stay busy. We'll have plenty to talk about.
Thank you so much. I guess we're out of time, so I'll turn it back over to Chris to close us out. But thank you, Claudia and Wendy. It was great. A great conversation.
Thank you.
Well, thanks, everyone. I want to thank everyone for joining today. Just as a reminder, recordings of past NABE webinars are available on the NABE Connect app, and the recordings are available for NABE members on the NABE.com digital archive. Okay, thank you to Wendy, Claudia, Diane. Great event. We'll see everyone next time. Just as a reminder, today's program is copyright 2021 by the National Association for Business Economics with all rights reserved. Thank you all again. And disconnect. See you next time.
Thank you.